So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And always remember, for all Dharma meditation practices, it is very important to keep precepts and conducts well, and to practice under supervision of a qualified, experienced teacher. So today's topic, the dependent origination. There are many other names for this, codependent arising, many different variations. Paticca samuppada in Pali. So we'll start with continuing to stay calm. Don't stress and worry too much about this subject. It's a slow, gradual teaching. You need time to absorb, and we can be going over this several times in different ways. Now focus on your breathing. Breathing in, breathing out. Breathing in and breathing out, focusing on that, calming the mind. And appreciate this view. Clean nature, undisturbed. So our topic begins along the lines of the subject of where conditions create other conditions. But in this case, the central one is craving. And preceding it is unawareness. And following it is attachment. But you can't have attachment without craving, and you can't have craving without attachment. Craving depends on unawareness, and unawareness gives rise to craving. So they all co-support. Leaders and misdirectors also don't help. And it can be laughable, it can seem like a cartoon. But it could also have very dire consequences. The greed and the avarice, the desire for material properties, for more and more and more and more, can have great consequences, grave consequences. You see here, scenes like this can turn into scenes like this on account of these factors. And a being was concerning themselves with this question, and simply put, the Buddha was once asked, what causes beings to live hating, harming, and hostility, when they actually wish to live without hate or harm and hostility? And the Buddha answered that it was jealousy, extreme greed for wealth, and material gain. That was the cause. And the terms used there for jealousy and extreme greed for wealth, it came from Issa Macharya. And this can also cover the two terms I've heard, envy and jealousy. Envy is more plain greed and competition to try to get what you have, whereas jealousy is, I want to destroy your ability to have it. Jealousy is more, it has the greed and the fixation bit also has the aggression and destructiveness in it. The questioner then asked, well, what was the cause of jealousy and extreme greed for wealth and material gain? How are jealousy, envy, and greed born? How do jealousy, envy, and greed arise? And also, what, if it was absent, would stop the arising of jealousy and greed for material wealth? And the Buddha answered that it was liking and disliking that was the cause. Or we can say affection and disaffection. So the term is piya, apiya. So it's really piya, apiya. It's very impure fondness and lack of it. The questioner then asked, well, what was the cause of liking and disliking? How are they born? How do they arise? And what, if it was absent, would stop the arising of liking and disliking? And you can see here, make a note there that this thing, the presence of something being a cause, and therefore the absence of something being a cause. And the Buddha answered that it was liking and disliking that was the cause. The presence of liking, the presence of disliking. And that was the cause for jealousy and envy. So the teachings introduce a style where a causes and effects, or if there are no causes, there are no effects, pattern of thinking is introduced. It's not all caused by a God, an invisible hand, and it's not all just, causeless and spontaneous and random. And it's not all predestined and out of our control. It's not the moon or the sun or the planets causing all the effects in the world and everything to be as it is. In fact, perhaps to emphasize this, it was an actual god, Sakka, that was transported down from heaven asking those questions. And it would have been, very prevalent at that time. The thought that everything happens because of God's will. Let's have a moment just to digest that. Just take a few breaths. What causes negative mind states? What causes war, hate, and conflict? So, seeing the Buddha's first links there. So he starts to put it in terms that people can understand. And then, over the years of teaching, the 12 links of phenomena coming into existence that cause human responses gradually revealed. And these are the same 12 links the Buddha had used to attain his enlightenment. And here they are. They're going to be introduced over a series of linking car parts that you might have seen. But it's to emphasize this idea that this leads to this, this leads to this, and this leads to this. And if you didn't have this, that wouldn't happen. And that made this happen. Now, often we see the dependent origination drawn like this. It can be a bit confusing. It takes a long time to percolate that. So I thought I'd have some fun and put it over a automobile advert that was very popular way back a few years, and show the links later on we'll go into those links and we'll slow it down a little bit. Here you go. Often we see this teaching in a circular format. But in order to understand that, at least one version, you need to understand the way that those factors arranged around the circle trigger each other. Because it's one version I've heard from the Burmese teacher Sayadaw U Pandita was, it's not that they happen like as a fan, like a fan that whizzes round, or a clock. Second hand, it's not like that. So I'll show you what I mean. He explained that these three red ones co-arise, and that causes the yellow one to arise, and that makes the mind state happen. And that forms one thing, which forms another thing, which makes the feelings happen, and that triggers around, inevitably pushing on birth. And if you have birth, you have aging, you have death. So that was news to me, that these three co-arise. And that's also what triggers the number 2 step, if you like, to happen. So let's look again about that. So our first point there is going to be ignorance, but that gives rise to these other two that co-arise. That's craving and attachment. And those three are a condition for this kind of vacuum, this potential that easily causes anger, hatred, and jealousy and desire to arise, the lower states there. If we've got ignorance, craving, and attachment, then that makes the mind states and the body and the mind tone, and that affects the way that the 6 senses behave, and that causes effects with the feelings of the body and the mind, all of which push around the eventual effects. And that's a condition for these other 3 to arise. Right up to death. So whenever we have ignorance leading to suffering, ignorance will always bring with it destruction, and this is represented here by this pollution and vacuous, soulless kind of spaces. which makes you appreciate peace, that calm and the quiet life that we can have. It's there that the dependent origination models we often see start with a very negative assumption. They start with ignorance. But what happens if we are starting being mindful, we're starting noting, we're starting with that wise awareness? It would look very different. So let's take a look at the more positive aspect of it. Healthy environment, contemplating wisdom of the Buddha, inspirational. How would that look? Ignorance would be replaced. So what happens if it starts with wise awareness? And we have a calm reflection on these topics. Rising, falling, sitting and touching. Rising, falling, sitting, touching. So with wiser awareness of when distractions arise about this, the body and the sensations, with more complete awareness. Knowing the body in the body. So before we had craving and very disturbing things also arising with ignorance. This time it would be the opposite, contentment, wise awareness and contentment. Rising and falling. Wise awareness, contentment and non-attachment. And before we had ignorance, craving and attachment. So this time the opposite. And these three, they co-support each other. With wiser awareness, we have more contentment. With non-attachment, we have wiser awareness. With contentment, we have non-attachment. With non-attachment, we have contentment. We're okay with things as they are, and this gives rise to healthy mind states. The contentment has calm senses, no craving sensations. It has not wanting to be this or that, and also not wanting to be this or that, and demanding and resistance. Yeah. So these three, as they co-arise, wise awareness, contentment and non-attachment, Well, they're a condition for this not having craving emptiness, no neediness, no cause for emotional reactions. And when this and this arise, they are conditions for healthy mind states. So we've got things like loving kindness, friendliness, cooperation, generosity, faith. All of the healthy mind states, mindfulness, they all rise up, seeing things as they are. And that then in turn, that is a sankhara also. It's also a conditioned response. And through the vijnana, it causes the entire body and mind to feel contentment and aware. And that in turn affects the salayatana, the senses, and that affects the feelings, both of body and mind. And that again feeds the contentment, and the contentment feeds more awareness. And that is the condition for that to arise, which is not jumping to exist, and it's not jumping to age and decay, and it's not jumping to deathly destruction. It's smooth, calm, and seeing things as they are in the present moment, not with a self-referential way of seeing things. So this would be a dependent arising, starting with wiser awareness, a more complete awareness. So all in all, we have this new way of looking things that hadn't been around before, that we're more familiar with when it comes to the material external world. That you have this condition, you put it together with that, and that happens. If you didn't have the first two, well, you couldn't have the other one. So it was the Buddha then way ahead of his time, applying that kind of thinking, that kind of approach in meditation, with his rising and falling, and watching the breathing and stilling the mind right down into a clear and perceptive state to see what causes what to arise, and therefore how we can bring it to stillness and ending. And then noting awareness of hearing, and noting awareness of reflecting, awareness of thought, all helps us to collect and bring the mind to a state of clarity, from which we can see everything's passing. Everything is impermanent. Every sense contact, every bit of experience, warmth, sponginess, hardness, is all coming into focus and then passing away. Every breath has this characteristic of change. And then we can experience that contentment, and we can experience non-attachment, and just simply let things go. So let's move on to meditation.